The screech of metal against linoleum cut through the diner. The waitress stumbled backward. Her coffee pot clattered to the floor. No one stood. At a booth near the window sat a Navy SEAL, a disciplined canine resting silent at his boots. No interference, no movement, not a single gesture. The man wearing the badge had grown accustomed to compliance in this town, accustomed to terror, accustomed to witnesses turning their heads. His authority had convinced him he was beyond consequences. That conviction was mistaken. The boundary he crossed belonged to a Navy SEAL who understood exactly when patience ended. Thank you for sticking around with me, my wonderful story family. If you're already hooked in for today's story and ready to enjoy it, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one, and you don't want to miss it. Now let us begin. Late winter in the Western Territories didn't arrive with grace. It descended like a physical threat that worked its way into everything, into the frozen earth, into the weathered siding of forgotten structures, into the exhale that crystallized before it could drift away. A pale, unforgiving sun struggled behind thick cloud cover, and the two-lane highway sliced through the high desert in long, monotonous stretches bordered by scrub brush and patches of dirty snow that resembled scattered debris more than frost. The town was the kind motorists overlooked without trying. One central street, a handful of faded businesses, and a roadside diner perched at the intersection of asphalt and emptiness, its blue neon sign flickering irregularly like a pulse considering surrender. Inside that diner, heat existed only because the furnace worked overtime, and conversations remained hushed because experience had taught that raised voices drew unwanted scrutiny. Jack Mercer arrived without ceremony, a dust-covered sedan rolling across the gravel lot, tires crunching loose stone, engine settling into silence. He remained motionless for several seconds with both palms on the steering wheel, posture loose, head angled slightly downward, vision cataloging the interior through smudged glass, the entrance, the exits, the single patrol vehicle positioned with deliberate arrogance near the building's side. Jack was 36, tall with the kind of lean, functional muscle that suggested capability without advertising it. His dark brown hair was cropped in an uncompromising military cut, tight fade on the sides, minimal length on top, no civilian softening because old patterns outlasted intention. A close-trimmed beard defined his angular jaw, precise and maintained, and a faded scar traced along his left cheekbone like an old lesson learned. His gray-blue eyes held the calculated stillness of a man trained to observe while remaining unobserved, but his expression offered no warmth, no aggression either, just presence, controlled and quiet. He wore a standard Navy working uniform, Type 3 Navy working uniform in the AOR-2 pattern, desert digital blouse and trousers, sleeves rolled to regulation length, Velcro patches stripped clean, with no name tape, no rank insignia, no unit identification, and tan desert combat boots worn smooth with use. He appeared to be someone who had departed one life without fully entering another. At his right side, the canine moved as though the cold held no authority over him. The Belgian Malinois was 4 years old, compact and densely muscled, with a rich fawn coat deepening to black across his shoulders, spine, and muzzle, a pattern that made his amber eyes seem to burn with greater intensity when his focus locked. The dog's chest was deep, his limbs coiled with disciplined energy, his bearing professional. No excess movement, no reactive surveillance, only a steady, trained vigilance forged through countless repetitions and absolute trust. He wore a simple leather collar, dark and utilitarian. The tactical vest would come later, but for now it was only the collar. The dog's name remained unspoken, the same way Jack kept his own identity concealed. The coffee was terrible, but Jack drank it anyway. It gave his hands something to do while his mind cataloged the room with the same methodical precision he'd used in a dozen foreign cities where the wrong glance could end a mission. 4 booths along the windows, all empty except his. A counter with 6 stools, 3 occupied by men who kept their shoulders hunched and their voices low. The kitchen door swung on tired hinges, releasing brief clouds of grease-scented steam each time the waitress pushed through. Sheila Collins moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to make herself small. Mid-30s, her blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail that had started to come loose, her uniform clean but faded from too many wash cycles. She refilled cups without being asked, cleared plates with minimal sound, and never made eye contact for longer than necessary. Jack recognized the behavior. He'd seen it in occupied territories, in places where survival meant becoming invisible to those who carried weapons. The door opened with a blast of cold air that made the neon sign flicker worse. Sheriff Derek Harlow entered like he owned not just the building, but the oxygen inside it. He was a big man gone soft in the middle, his uniform straining across a gut that spoke of years without accountability. His face carried a ruddy flush that could have been wind or whiskey or both, and his eyes moved across the diner with the lazy confidence of a predator who'd never met resistance. "Sheila?" His voice filled the space, too loud, deliberately invasive. "Where's my pie?" She appeared from behind the counter, holding a plate. "Right here, Sheriff. Apple, just like—" "I said cherry." He didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. The correction landed like a physical blow, and Jack watched her flinch, watched her fingers tighten on the plate's edge. "I'm sorry, I thought you said—" "You calling me a liar?" Harlow moved closer, and the 3 men at the counter found sudden interest in their coffee. "You think because you work here you can disrespect me?" Sheila stepped back. Her spine met the counter. "No, sir, I just—" His hand shot out and clamped around her upper arm with enough force to make her gasp. The plate fell, shattering against the linoleum in an explosion of ceramic and filling that seemed obscenely loud in the frozen silence. "You need a lesson in respect. Come on." He started dragging her toward the back hallway, toward the storage room with its single dim bulb and no windows. Sheila's feet scraped against the floor, her free hand grasping at nothing, and the sound that came from her throat was something between a plea and a whimper. Jack's fingers remained steady on his coffee cup. The canine's ears shifted forward, amber eyes tracking the movement with surgical focus, but the dog didn't rise, didn't growl. The training held. Every patron in the diner found somewhere else to look. The cook disappeared deeper into the kitchen. George, the owner, studied the register like it contained secrets he'd spent his life searching for. This was how it always went in this town. This was how Harlow had operated for 6 years without consequence. The sheriff's eyes found Jack as he passed the booth, saw the uniform, saw the stillness, and smiled. Military boy knows better than to get involved. Smart man. The storage room door was 3 steps away. 2 steps. 1. Jack set down his cup without a sound. The assessment took less than 3 seconds, the kind of rapid threat analysis that had become as natural as breathing. Harlow's center of gravity was high, weight distributed poorly across legs that showed no evidence of regular training. The gun belt sat loose on his hips, sagging under its own weight, the retention strap already unfastened, careless, the habit of a man who'd never faced genuine opposition. His right hand gripped Sheila's arm with all his strength, which meant it wasn't available for defense. His left hung free, but would need to travel across his body to reach the service weapon, a journey that would cost him nearly 2 full seconds in combat time. More importantly, Harlow was drunk. Not falling down drunk, but enough that his pupils were slightly dilated and his balance required conscious thought. Jack had seen it in the way he'd navigated around the counter, the fractional pause before each step, the overcompensation in his movements. Alcohol slowed reaction time by an average of 120 milliseconds. In close quarters, that delay was fatal. The sheriff's physical condition told another story. The gut that strained against his uniform shirt meant compromised cardiovascular capacity. The flush in his cheeks suggested hypertension, probably unmedicated. His breathing was already elevated from the effort of dragging Sheila, shallow pulls through his mouth rather than deep draws through his nose. In a sustained confrontation, he'd be winded inside 45 seconds. Jack's eyes tracked the environmental factors with the same cold precision. The hallway to the storage room was narrow, maybe 4 feet across, which neutralized any advantage Harlow's size might offer. The floor was linoleum over concrete, good traction, no give. The overhead lights were fluorescent, bright enough to eliminate shadows, but positioned to create glare if someone moved quickly from the darker dining area. The storage room door opened inward, which meant Harlow would need to release Sheila or turn his back to push it open. Either choice created a vulnerability window. The canine had already made his own calculations. His weight had shifted forward onto his front legs, haunches coiled like compressed springs, ready to explode into motion on command. His breathing remained controlled, silent, but his focus had narrowed to a single point, Harlow's gun hand. The dog had been trained to recognize the specific geometry of threat, the angle of an arm reaching for a weapon, and his amber eyes tracked the sheriff's left side with absolute concentration. No aggression showed in his posture, no raised hackles or bared teeth, only professional readiness. He was waiting for the signal, the single word or gesture that would transform him from observer to weapon. Jack noted the distance, 12 feet from his booth to where Harlow stood, 8 feet from Harlow to the storage room door. The sheriff would need approximately 6 seconds to get Sheila inside and close the door, assuming she continued to resist at her current level. 6 seconds. The dog could close 12 feet in under 2 seconds. Jack could do it in 3, maybe less if he didn't bother with subtlety. But timing mattered more than speed. Strike too early and Harlow might release Sheila and draw. Too late and the door would close, creating a hostage situation that complicated everything. The optimal intervention point was the moment Harlow committed to opening the door, when his attention divided and his hands occupied. Jack's pulse remained steady at 62 beats per minute. His hands rested flat on the table, relaxed but positioned for immediate movement. Every muscle in his body existed in that peculiar state of controlled tension that characterized true readiness. Not rigid, not loose, but calibrated. Sheila's eyes found his across the diner, terrified, pleading, searching for something she'd stopped expecting to find in this town. Jack stood. Derek Harlow had been sheriff for 6 years, but his education in cruelty had started long before the badge. He'd grown up in this town, the kind of boy who learned early that size and volume could substitute for character, that fear was easier to cultivate than respect. His father had worn the same badge before him, had ruled the county with the same iron fist wrapped in legal authority, and young Derek had absorbed the lesson like gospel. The law existed to protect those who wielded it, not those who lived under it. When old Sheriff Harlow died of a heart attack in his patrol car, the transition felt inevitable. Derek ran unopposed, not because he was qualified, but because no one dared to challenge the legacy. The county commissioners, men who'd grown comfortable under the previous regime, saw no reason to disturb an arrangement that kept their own indiscretions buried. They pinned the badge on Derek's chest and looked the other way. The first year, he'd been almost restrained. Small abuses, testing boundaries, a traffic stop that lasted 3 hours for a woman who'd rejected his advances at the county fair. Evidence that disappeared from the lockup when it implicated the commissioner's nephew. Fines that quadrupled for anyone who questioned his authority. The town learned quickly that complaints went nowhere. The state police had their own territories to manage and showed little interest in the internal politics of a county that generated minimal paperwork and fewer headlines. By year 3, Harlow had stopped pretending. He drank on duty, his cruiser a mobile bar that reeked of bourbon and stale cigarettes. He collected tribute from the truck stop on the interstate, $300 a week to ignore the prostitution operating out of the motel next door. He entered homes without warrants, searched vehicles without cause, and made arrests based on mood rather than evidence. The courthouse became a theater where defense attorneys went through motions they knew were futile, where judges handed down sentences calibrated to please the sheriff rather than serve justice. George, who owned the diner, had tried to file a formal complaint after Harlow broke his son's arm during a traffic stop. The paperwork disappeared. The county attorney, a man whose gambling debts Harlow had personally documented, suggested George focus on his business and forget the incident. 2 weeks later, the health inspector found violations that had never existed before. George paid the fines and learned his lesson. Lena Martinez, the deputy who joined the department believing she could make a difference, had compiled evidence for 18 months. Incident reports, witness statements, photographs of bruises and broken property. She'd driven 3 hours to meet with a state investigator who listened politely and promised to look into it. Nothing happened. The investigator's daughter got a scholarship that year, funded by a county program that never existed before and never would again. The pattern became doctrine. Harlow operated with absolute impunity because the system had calcified around him, because those with power to stop him benefited from his corruption, and because the people he terrorized had learned that resistance only multiplied suffering. He believed himself untouchable because for 6 years he had been. That belief carried him across the diner floor with Sheila struggling against his grip, carried him past the silent witnesses and the man in the military uniform who surely knew better to interfere. That belief was about to shatter. Harlow's boots struck the linoleum with deliberate weight, each step a demonstration of authority unchallenged. Sheila's sneakers scraped against the floor as she tried to find purchase, tried to slow the inevitable march toward the hallway that led to the storage room. Her free hand clutched at the counter's edge as they passed, fingers white with desperation, but Harlow yanked her forward hard enough that her grip broke with a sound like a gasp. "Please," she said, the word barely audible, directed at no one and everyone. "Please, someone!" "Shut your mouth." Harlow's voice carried the casual cruelty of a man who'd never faced consequences for using it. "You're making this worse for yourself." The men at the counter remained frozen, their coffee going cold in cups they'd forgotten they were holding. One of them, an older man with weathered hands that spoke of decades of manual labor, closed his eyes as if the absence of sight might absolve him of witnessing. The cook's silhouette disappeared completely from the kitchen window, retreating into the back where he could claim ignorance. George stood behind the register, his face carved from the same pale stone as the mountains outside, every line in his features a testament to choices made and unmade, to the slow erosion of a man's spine under the weight of practical surrender. His hand rested on the phone, fingers motionless, not even pretending he might dial. Harlow's gaze swept the room with satisfaction, feeding on the silence like it was oxygen. Then his eyes landed on Jack, still standing beside his booth, and something shifted in his expression. Amusement mixed with contempt, the look of a predator encountering another predator's markings and dismissing them as forgery. "Military, huh?" Harlow stopped, forcing Sheila to stop with him, keeping her between himself and Jack like a shield he didn't need but enjoyed using anyway. "You got that hard look, like you've seen some things. Bet you have. Bet you've done some things, too." He smiled, showing teeth that had gone yellow from tobacco and neglect. "But you're smart enough to know this ain't your business. This is local jurisdiction. This is my town, my rules, and that uniform don't mean shit here." Jack said nothing. His hands hung loose at his sides, his posture unchanged, his expression offering no reaction to catalog or exploit. The canine remained seated, but the dog's eyes had locked onto Harlow with the kind of focus that preceded violence, amber irises tracking every micro-movement. "That's what I thought." Harlow's laugh was wet and ugly. "You boys are all the same. Tough overseas where the rules are different, but back home, you know better than to step out of line. You know what happens when you interfere with law enforcement." He turned back toward the hallway, his grip tightening on Sheila's arm hard enough that make her whimper. 3 more steps and they'd cross the threshold into the corridor. 4 more and they'd reach the storage room door with its single bulb and walls thick enough to muffle sound. "Smart man," Harlow said over his shoulder, already dismissing Jack from consideration. "Just sit down and finish your coffee. Forget you saw anything. That's how it works here." The hallway entrance loomed ahead, a rectangle of shadow that seemed darker than it should, as if the fluorescent lights couldn't quite reach into that space where accountability went to die. Sheila's eyes found Jack again, and this time there was no hope in them, only resignation, the look of someone who'd learned that heroes didn't exist outside of stories told to children. Jack's voice cut through the silence like a blade through silk, quiet but absolute. "Let her Go." Harlow's head turned slowly, disbelief registering before anger, as if his brain needed an extra moment to process the impossibility of what he'd just heard. His grip on Sheila loosened fractionally, not from compliance, but from shock. And in that microsecond of distraction, Jack moved. 3 steps closed the 12 feet between them. Not running, not rushing, just efficient forward motion with zero wasted energy. His boots made no sound against the linoleum. By the time Harlow's hand started its journey toward his service weapon, Jack was already inside his reach, already past the point where drawing would matter. Jack's left hand shot out and clamped onto Harlow's wrist before his fingers could brush the gun's grip, applying pressure to the radial nerve with surgical precision. Harlow's hand went numb instantly, fingers splaying open in involuntary release. Jack's right hand secured Sheila's arm, his touch gentle but firm, and he guided her backward with a single smooth motion that put her behind him and out of the combat zone. "Stay back," he said to her, his eyes never leaving Harlow. The sheriff's face had gone from ruddy to crimson, rage flooding through alcohol-slowed synapses. He swung his free hand in a wide, looping haymaker that telegraphed its trajectory 3 seconds before arrival. Jack swayed backwards 6 inches, let the fist sail past his face close enough to feel the displacement of air, then stepped inside Harlow's extended arm and drove his elbow into the sheriff's solar plexus. The impact folded Harlow forward, drove the air from his lungs in an explosive gasp that smelled of bourbon and bile. Jack pivoted, used Harlow's forward momentum against him, and swept the sheriff's lead leg with his own. Physics took over. Harlow went down hard, his back slamming into the linoleum with enough force to rattle the plates stacked on the nearby counter. He tried to rise, tried to reach for the gun again, and Jack dropped onto him with controlled force, knee pinning Harlow's gun arm to the floor, one hand securing the sheriff's opposite wrist. The canine was there in an instant, positioned at Harlow's head, teeth visible now, a low growl vibrating through the air that promised violence if the command came. "Don't move," Jack said. Harlow bucked, tried to leverage his weight, tried to use his size advantage, but Jack's positioning had eliminated every mechanical advantage. The sheriff's face was 6 inches from the floor, Jack's knee pressed into his tricep with enough pressure to make the muscle scream, and every attempt to shift only tightened the control. "You don't know who you're fucking with," Harlow snarled, spittle flying from his lips. "I'm the law here. I'll have you in a cell by midnight. I'll bury you so deep." Jack increased the pressure fractionally, just enough to make Harlow's arm go numb. "You were dragging a woman into a back room against her will. That's not law, that's assault. She's nothing, a goddamn waitress who doesn't know her place. She's a person, and you're done." Harlow tried to twist, tried to bring his free leg up for leverage, and the canine's growl deepened, the dog's muzzle now inches from the sheriff's face, amber eyes blazing with barely restrained aggression. "Call him off." Harlow's voice had lost its authority, fear creeping in at the edges. "Call off the fucking dog." Jack's expression didn't change. "He only moves when I tell him to, same as you're going to do. You're going to stay on this floor until someone with actual authority arrives." The diner remained frozen, every witness locked in place, watching a hierarchy invert before their eyes. Jack's hand moved to Harlow's belt, fingers locating the handcuff case with practiced efficiency. The metal restraints slid free with a familiar click, standard-issue Smith & Wesson chain-link cuffs that had probably decorated more innocent wrists than guilty ones during Harlow's tenure. The irony wasn't lost on Jack as he secured the sheriff's right wrist first, the ratchet mechanism engaging with precise clicks that echoed through the silent diner like a countdown. "You can't do this," Harlow said, but the bluster had drained from his voice, replaced by something that resembled genuine panic. "You're assaulting an officer. That's a felony. That's—" Jack brought Harlow's left arm around with controlled force, ignoring the resistance, and closed the second cuff. The sheriff's wrists were now bound behind his back, secured with his own instrument of authority, and the symbolism wasn't subtle. "You were committing a crime. I stopped it. Everything else is just documentation." He stood, stepping back to give Harlow space, but not opportunity. The canine maintained position, still coiled and ready, eyes locked on the sheriff with unwavering intensity. Jack's hand moved in a small gesture, a subtle command, and the dog eased back slightly but didn't fully stand down. Harlow rolled onto his side, then struggled to his knees, the cuffs forcing his shoulders into an awkward angle that made every movement graceless. His face had gone from crimson to pale, sweat beading on his forehead, despite the cold air still seeping through the poorly sealed windows. He looked smaller now, diminished, a predator stripped of camouflage and revealed as something far less formidable. "Someone called the state police," Jack said, his voice carrying to every corner of the diner without rising in volume. No one moved. The men at the counter sat paralyzed, caught between years of conditioned fear and the evidence before their eyes that fear could be overcome. George still stood behind the register, his hand still on the phone, but his fingers remained motionless as if the muscle memory of submission had calcified into permanent inaction. It was Sheila who moved first. She stepped around Jack, her arm already showing the dark purple fingerprints where Harlow had gripped her, and walked to the counter with trembling legs that somehow carried her forward. She picked up the phone, her hands shaking so badly the receiver nearly slipped from her grasp, but she held on. Her eyes found Jack's, and something passed between them that required no words. Gratitude mixed with disbelief, relief mixed with the terror of knowing that stepping forward meant there was no stepping back. She dialed. The rotary mechanism clicked through the numbers with mechanical precision. "State Police," she said when the line connected, her voice stronger than her hands. "I need to report an assault by Sheriff Harlow at the diner on Route 40. The words hung in the air like smoke, visible and undeniable. One of the men at the counter stood, an older rancher whose weathered face had witnessed 6 years of Harlow's reign without protest. He moved to where Harlow knelt and looked down at the sheriff with an expression that mixed contempt with something closer to pity. "About time someone put you where you belong, Derek." Another patron rose, then another. The spell had broken, the collective paralysis shattered by the simple act of watching their tormentor reduced to a man in handcuffs, powerless and exposed. They didn't speak, didn't offer testimony or celebration, but they stood. They witnessed. And in a town where silence had been survival, bearing witness was revolution. Harlow's eyes swept across the faces now surrounding him, seeing judgment where he'd grown accustomed to fear, and for the first time in 6 years, he understood what it meant to be truly vulnerable. Jack remained apart, positioned near the window where he could watch both the interior and the highway beyond, waiting for the black and white cruisers that would arrive with questions he'd answer and authority he'd defer to. The canine sat at his side, discipline reasserted, the tactical threat transformed back into patient companion. Outside, the first snowflakes began to fall. The state police cruiser arrived 43 minutes later, its light bar cutting red and blue patterns through the falling snow. Deputy Lena Martinez had been listening to the radio dispatch when the call came through, and she'd made a choice in that moment that felt both terrifying and inevitable. She'd driven her personal vehicle, not the county cruiser that carried Harlow's authority by extension, and she'd brought the file box she'd kept hidden in her garage for 18 months. She entered the diner with the box cradled against her chest like evidence she'd excavated from a grave, which in a sense it was, the buried truth of a town that had learned to swallow its own testimony. Her eyes found Harlow on the floor, hands cuffed behind his back, and something shifted in her expression that looked like grief finally permitted to transform into anger. "Deputy Martinez," Jack said, his tone neutral, giving her the professional courtesy of rank even though they both knew that rank had been corrupted by association. "It's just Lena," she said quietly. "I stopped being his deputy the moment I started documenting what he really was." She set the box on the nearest table, and George emerged from behind the register as if he'd been waiting for permission his entire life. He moved with the slow deliberation of a man whose joints had stiffened from carrying weight that wasn't physical. And when he reached the storage room at the back, he returned with a lockbox that looked like it had been buried under inventory for years. "Incident reports," Lena said, opening her file box to reveal manila folders organized with obsessive precision, each one labeled with dates and names. 18 months of documentation, assaults, extortion, evidence tampering, witness intimidation, everything I could verify and photograph without him knowing. George placed his lockbox beside hers, the metal surface scarred and dented. His hands shook as he worked the combination, decades of fear making the simple mechanical act almost impossible. When the lid finally opened, it revealed stacks of papers held together with rubber bands that had gone brittle with age, photographs with dates written on the back in fading ink, and a small tape recorder that looked like a relic from another era. 6 years, George said, his voice barely above a whisper. Every time he came in here and made threats, every time he took money from the register and called it a safety tax, every conversation where he told me exactly what would happen to my family if I talked. He looked at Harlow, and his eyes held the accumulated weight of every moment he'd chosen silence over courage. I recorded it all, hid the tapes in coffee cans in the basement, told myself someday I'd use them, but someday never came because I was too afraid. Sheila approached the table, her movements hesitant, and pulled a folded piece of paper from her apron pocket. I wrote down every time he touched me, every comment, every threat. Her voice cracked but didn't break. 3 years of dates and details. I thought maybe if I ever got brave enough, or if someone ever cared enough to ask, I'd have proof it wasn't just one time, that it was a pattern. The rancher who'd been first to stand reached into his jacket and produced a worn leather notebook. He killed my dog 2 years ago, shot him in my driveway because I filed a complaint about him running stop signs drunk. I wrote down what he said after, kept the vet bill, kept the bullet the vet pulled out. One by one, the witnesses who'd remained silent for years began to produce their own evidence, their own careful documentation of crimes they'd never believed would be prosecuted. Receipts, photographs, medical records, written statements that had been composed in secret and hidden in drawers and boxes and places where hope went to wait. The table filled with the physical manifestation of a town's suppressed testimony, years of pain given form and weight, and Harlow watched it accumulate with the dawning realization that his protection had never been as absolute as he'd believed. The system had shielded him, but the people had been building a case in the shadows, waiting for the moment when speaking became possible. Lena looked at Jack, then at the evidence surrounding them. Will this be enough? Jack's expression remained unchanged, but something in his eyes suggested recognition of what he was witnessing, not just the end of one man's corruption, but the resurrection of a community's voice. That's not for me to decide, but someone should document all of this before the state investigators arrive. Lena nodded, already reaching for her phone to photograph every piece of evidence, to create a record that couldn't be disappeared or dismissed. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the tracks of what had been and preparing the ground for what might come next. The black sedans arrived 90 minutes later, 3 of them moving in formation down the highway like a funeral procession for corruption itself. They weren't state police cruisers with their local jurisdiction and potential contamination by Harlow's network. These were federal vehicles, unmarked except for the government plates that announced their authority without needing to advertise it. Special Agent Catherine Rhodes emerged from the lead sedan, a woman in her late 40s whose gray suit and precise movements suggested someone who'd built a career on dismantling exactly the kind of systems that had protected Harlow. She was accompanied by 2 other agents and a forensic accountant whose presence indicated they'd come prepared to follow money trails as well as witness statements. Lena met them at the door, her badge displayed not as authority but as evidence of her position inside the corruption she was about to expose. "Agent Rhodes, I'm Deputy Martinez. We spoke on the phone 6 months ago." Rhodes's expression shifted with recognition and something that might have been regret. "You're the one who sent the preliminary reports, the ones that got buried." "Yes, ma'am. They didn't get buried here." Lena gestured toward the table where the evidence had been organized into chronological stacks, each folder labeled and cross-referenced, the work of hours compressed into desperate efficiency. 18 months of documentation, plus 6 years of recordings and witness testimony from the townspeople. Rhodes approached the table with the careful attention of someone who understood that evidence this comprehensive didn't appear spontaneously. She lifted one of George's tape recordings, examined a medical photograph from Lena's files showing bruises on a woman's throat, read through a witness statement written in trembling handwriting that detailed extortion. Her jaw tightened with each piece she reviewed. "This is a RICO case," she said, not to anyone in particular but to the room itself, naming the framework that would transform local abuse into federal prosecution. "This is a pattern of racketeering, corruption under color of law, civil rights violations, and criminal conspiracy." She looked at Harlow, still cuffed on the floor, his earlier defiance replaced by the pale recognition of someone watching their life collapse into legal terminology. "Sheriff Harlow, you're being taken into federal custody pending investigation into charges that include but are not limited to assault, battery, extortion, witness tampering, and deprivation of rights under color of law." One of the agents moved forward with federal restraints, removing Harlow's own handcuffs and replacing them with ones that carried different weight, different meaning. These weren't the tools of local authority turned against itself. These were the instruments of a jurisdiction Harlow couldn't intimidate or corrupt. "You can't do this," Harlow said, but the words carried no conviction, only the reflexive denial of someone who'd built their identity on immunity. "I have rights, I have connections, I know people." "Your connections are part of the investigation," Rhodes said, her tone clinical. "The county commissioners who approved your budget irregularities, the state investigator who buried Deputy Martinez's reports, the county attorney who dismissed complaints, they're all being interviewed as we speak." She turned to the assembled townspeople, her expression softening fractionally. "I need statements from everyone who's willing to provide them. We have victim advocates on the way. We'll be thorough and we'll be fair, but I need you to understand that this is going to take time. Justice doesn't happen overnight, but it will happen." George stepped forward, his posture straighter than it had been in years. "How long have you known? How long has the federal government known what was happening here?" Rhodes met his eyes with the honesty of someone who understood the question wasn't really about timelines. "We suspected. We had fragments, but without cooperation from inside, without victims willing to come forward, we couldn't build a case that would survive his legal protections. What you've done here, what all of you have done, this is what breaks these systems. This is what makes prosecution possible." The agents escorted Harlow toward the door, and as they passed Jack, the sheriff's eyes found the man who'd started the collapse. "You should have minded your own business, military boy." Jack's expression didn't change. "She was my business the moment you put your hands on her." The door closed behind the federal agents and their prisoner, and the diner fell into a silence that felt entirely different from the one that had existed before. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of people processing the reality that the predator who'd defined their lives for 6 years was gone. Rhodes remained behind, already organizing the evidence for transport, already building the case that would ensure Harlow's removal was permanent. Jack left while the statements were still being taken, while Agent Rhodes was explaining victims' rights procedures to Sheila and setting up interview schedules with the others. He simply stood, collected his jacket from the booth, and moved toward the door with the same quiet efficiency he'd brought to everything else. The canine rose with him, shaking once to resettle his coat, then falling into position at Jack's left side with the automatic precision of thousands of hours of training. "Wait!" Sheila's voice stopped in 3 steps from the exit. She crossed the diner quickly, her footsteps urgent but uncertain, and when she reached him she seemed unsure what to do with her hands. They hovered near her chest, then dropped to her sides, then rose again as if searching for a gesture that matched what she needed to express. "I don't even know your name." "Jack," he said, offering nothing more, no rank or unit or explanation. "Jack." She repeated it like she was committing it to memory, filing it alongside the other details of this night she'd carry forever. "Thank you. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't—" Her voice fractured, the adrenaline that had sustained her through the past hours finally beginning to metabolize into the reality of what she'd survived. "You don't need to thank me." His tone was gentle but final, the words of someone who understood that gratitude, while offered sincerely, wasn't what he'd come for or what he needed to take away. Lena approached from the evidence table, her phone still in hand, documentation still incomplete, but enough now to stand on its own. "The federal agents will want a statement from you. You're a crucial witness." "I'll call from the road. They have my information." Jack's eyes moved past her to the window, to the snow that had thickened into a steady curtain of white. "You did the hard part. You kept the records when it would have been easier to forget. That took more courage than what I did." "What you did saved her life," Lena said quietly. "What you did is going to save this whole town." He nodded toward the evidence spread across the table. "That's the difference between stopping one crime and ending a system." George emerged from the kitchen carrying a paper bag that smelled of fresh coffee and something wrapped in wax paper. "For the road. It's a long drive to anywhere from here." He extended it toward Jack, and when Jack hesitated, George's expression took on a firmness that suggested this wasn't charity but necessity. "Let an old man say thank you the only way he knows how." Jack accepted the bag with a slight nod, the closest thing to acknowledgement he seemed willing to offer. "The coffee was terrible, by the way." George's laugh came out wet and unexpected, relief and grief and something like joy all compressed into a single sound. "I know, but you drank it anyway." The canine moved toward the door, and Jack followed, his hand resting briefly on the rancher's shoulder as he passed, a gesture so quick and understated it might have been imagined, but the old man's posture straightened under the weight of it. Outside, the snow had transformed the parking lot into unmarked white terrain, erasing tire tracks and footprints, covering evidence of what had occurred inside with the indifferent efficiency of nature reasserting itself. Jack's sedan sat alone now, the federal vehicles having departed with their prisoner, and he brushed snow from the windshield with his bare hand while the canine waited patiently beside the passenger door. The engine turned over on the first try, and warm air began its slow work against the accumulated cold. Jack sat for a moment with his hands on the wheel, the same position he'd held when he'd first arrived, and looked back at the diner through the settling snow. Inside, the lights burned warm against the darkness. People were talking, some crying, some laughing, experiencing the strange aftermath of liberation, the disorientation that comes when the threat that defined your world simply ceases to exist. He put the sedan in reverse, the tires finding purchase on snow-covered gravel, and pulled onto the highway heading west. The canine settled into the passenger seat, alert but relaxed, amber eyes watching the road ahead with the same disciplined readiness he'd shown throughout. The diner's neon sign flickered once more in the rearview mirror, then disappeared as distance and snowfall conspired to erase it from view. Jack Mercer drove into the falling snow, leaving behind a town that would remember him as a presence rather than a person, a moment of intervention that required no name or story to validate its necessity. He'd served a justice that demanded no applause, answered a call that wasn't his to ignore, and somewhere in the execution of that simple moral arithmetic, he'd found something he didn't know he was searching for. Proof that his skills could protect rather than destroy, that the weapon could choose to be a man. The road stretched ahead into darkness and snow, and Jack followed it toward whatever waited in the silence beyond.